Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here. And like a few others, yesterday started with a personal reflection for my connection to Lakatos. So I did the same. I did my PhD in Edinburgh on Thomas Kuhn, the problem of meaning change. And of course, when you work on Thomas Kuhn, then you are bound to read Lakatos' Fire Up and a Popper. So that was the sort of one of the first connections. After that, I've done other things, among others, philosophy of history, historiography. For the book, and edited a journal, and did other stuff there. And then it took me back to Lakatos. And I saw there's something in Lakatos's approach to history writing. And one might even say that he was a bit ahead of his time, and I'm trying to tell you why. And unlike one of the keynote speakers yesterday, I think the normative and descriptive are very closely intertwined. So the title was, as you all see, Lakatosian rational reconstruction updated. So I think it can be updated, and there's something that is still useful for contemporary HPS or science studies, or in any case for historiography of science, as it has been written in the past decades. We could say that the main idea is really encapsulated here in this Lakatos's phrase. I maintain that all historians of science use willy-nilly some rational reconstruction, that all histories of science are always philosophies fabricating examples. So we are bound to use, when we write history, we are bound to do some kind of rational reconstruction, rather than have an I believe that there is only a descriptive history of science, so the general history of science could be written as it really has been. This is, of course, the old idea of Frankian, yes, I can be given that we can write history as it was. Facts speak for themselves. And anyone who has at least a little bit followed discussing philosophy of history, theory of history, and this is totally rejected. And you can go into great depth in this why. There are many reasons: narratives, meanings, morals, synthesizing principles, discrepancies between the factual level and the higher level, synthesizing level. So this is the plan of the talk today. So I'm trying to, I'm calling it now philosophy of historiography. Historiography means really discipline of history, study and writing of history, as opposed to the events themselves. Actually, Lakatos is one of the few who realized that history has, or actually pointed out that history has this double meaning the practice of making accounts of history and the events themselves. Okay, a few positives, calling hierarchies of interpretation. I read him as a non-realist, also non-representationalist, and then that he actually took steps to compare different accounts of history of science. Then there are some textual interpretive problems, so I'll take up a few of them and try to answer. One has to do with the idea of actual history. He uses this phrase often. And these are the kind of accusations that have been directed at Lakatos, that it's a kind of ideal utopia. History writing, and he imposes this kind of distorting normativity as opposed to ideal descriptivity. And then I'm trying to very briefly to give some criteria on how we could compare. And I think we can talk about, well, Lakatos obviously highlights rationally estimated criteria. I'm trying to suggest to divide it in framework, dependent and framework, independent rationality. And if there's time, some few illustrations how this program might work. And as you see, there's this, some years ago I wrote the paper, there's the paper to go with it if you're interested in some more details and want to look at them or maybe disagree with me. Still the aims of this talk is indeed that my feeling that one aspect, this aspect of Lakatos's philosophy has been largely ignored, and that's the non-realism and regarding now history writing. And I think this has a great potential to contribute to philosophy of historiography and to the HPS more generally. And the idea is really using methodology as an objective surrogate for truth. This is something that actually iron hacking has pointed out very briefly. And then one more, trying to give some, at least some ingredients for how we could really compare this historiographical research program through rationality. Okay, let's get into positive aspects. And as you can see, earlier in my life, I have visited the library in the highest floor. There are the archives, archives, and interesting stuff. Also, I didn't find so much new there, but you can always kind of interesting notes and scribblings. So, hierarchies of interpretation, and this is something that really links to Lakatos and then links to philosophy of historiography. This is very well known, of course. It's the first page of the Lakatos's paper, History of Science and Rational Reconstruction. But let's look at them briefly. So, philosophy of science provides normative methodologies in terms of its history and reconstructs the internal history, and therefore provides a rational explanation of the growth of the group. So, normative methodologies, one thing to highlight. Two competing methodologies can be evaluated with the help of normatively interpreted history. So, there's competing or comparativity, and then any rational reconstruction needs to be supplemented by external history. And this links to the discussion that we had yesterday, where we had very similar ideas in the session yesterday. And as you all probably know, Lakatos's methodologies, all philosophies of science, I take this as a technical term of a methodology framework, not the philosophy of science, as a discipline of philosophy of science. So they are inductivism, conventionalism, falsificationism, highlighted elitism yesterday, and his own methodology of research. So I regard these all alternative methodologies, with the help of which we can make sense of the past. And then, what is the hierarchy of interpretation? I think nicely Lakatos fits this discussion that has been going on for a few decades. Indeed, the key realization, one of them is that there are these parallel frameworks, inductivism, falsificationism, and so on and so forth. All can be used to make sense of the reconstruction, better or worse. Okay, we need some criterion to how to combat them. And the idea is that you can sort of give the same data, some historical data, and you have researchers with different framework mindset, and ask them to make sense of the history. They all can make sense of it up to a point. And none of them is given by the past itself. They are all conventional. So they basically come from the historian as philosopher as historian, or from the interpretative culture itself. So the hierarchy is this. If we have this historiographic research program at the highest level, within any of them you can have narratives. So you can have different stories or narratives, let's say, embedded in falsifications. So you get their falsification stories about Newton and others. That's possible. That's the second level. The lowest level is then this data itself. So data means exactly the archival data that you can find, stuff, sources, material, and so on. So we have three levels, and of course, if you have the data, so you have research material, it's not the history. You need a lot of stuff to turn that into any sensible account. Now, I think in this reading, because any account needs a framework, this high-level framework to make sense, I read it Lakatos as giving up any pretension to write history as it really happened, this German Franklin idea, wie es eigentlich gewesen. So no philosophy of science is true. No, it can't be true. It's a framework. Our framework would even be true, at least in representations. As you change the idea of what means being true. And I think this is a positive stepping back. Now we have something we can shift our focus on, those criteria needed to choose between different interpretation methodologies of philosophies of science. And this is the luckiest hacking quotation. Lakatos's problem is to provide a theory of objectivity without representation of theory of truth. So, writing history is not forming a representation that fits a mirror in the past. And this makes me to say that he avoids the pitfall of both naive realism but also relativism, because there are criteria with which to compare. There's comparativity, of course, and then we need the idea of rationality. And then indeed, without assuming absolute representational realism, that any one of the constructions is true in any absolutist sense. And then this Lakatosian's idea, this key idea of a distinction between internal and external, and as you know, if you have read the HBS literature, this hasn't been exactly in fashion anymore, this external and internal. Especially historians of science, people doing science studies, sociology of science have criticized it heavily. Maybe for good reasons sometimes, but I think there's a good interpretation that we can give to it. So Lakatosian's maxim was to make as much history of science rational as possible. And then externalists just needed to fill in the sort of explanatory gap, because not all of history, I mean, all of what people do in the name of science can be embedded in the framework of rational. There's always something left over. It's always reason that is rational reconstruction. However, and this is the key for comparative aspect, if you have to rely on external factors as an explanation, it's always a defect, it's always a failure. So the more you can make rational, the better it is in Lakatosian framework. Of course, I haven't yet said anything about rational means. I try to say that at the end. It's a meta-criterion in any way, and enables to compare these different historical episodes with an intention to maximize rationality, leave as little as possible for external explanatory factors. And this is the key here. Like, I think, some similar, we are in agreement, I think different frameworks in their own principle of rationality. What I mean, they're all ways to explain their own explanatory notions. Realism has quite different from academic theory, let's say. What explains what's explanatory, what is even needed to explain. The key, if you read this in the Lakatosian framework, is that, and there's, I think, a surprising link to naturalism in Lakatos. So if your framework makes the history of science, the past science, very irrational, there's something not wrong with the science, the scientist necessarily, but maybe your interpretive framework. So better consider choosing a different framework or compare it to another. And if the other is able to make better sense, it's more rational than choose the other. And yeah, this is something to explore perhaps further some other time. I mean, who was already thinking in the along similar lines that the science is by and large is a rational activity, and philosophers should not impose an external notion of rationality to science and scientists, rather learn from the science. Okay, we get into some problems. This is the main idea. And the first problem is really indeed Lakatosian's repeated references to actual history. That it could be used as an arbiter between different methodologies. Kuhn says there is no such actual history. And I picked up another, so Jamita writes there is no access to history unmediated by historical interpretation. And this is a problem, indeed. If we have this idea of this actual history in the sense that, account of historia, it has a lot of meanings, morals, and narratives, and so on, values. It has a specific order of events or facts, if you like. But if that's given by the past itself, why would we even need the methodologies? Why not to write as it is indeed? Write the actual history? And that would impose a contradiction with the non-realism of Lakatosian's claims. I think this can be, we can go around this. and actually two suggestions. So there's, in a way, actual history. There's this data, there's historical evidence, there's documents, there's sources, and that's undeniable. That's a sort of material aspect of actual history that you can go and find. Now, your job is to make sense, put them in some order. Of course, we could also take a bit more demanding idea. There are sort of shared conceptions what has taken place in history and science. Darwin traveled to Galapagos Islands to study finches, and Ignaz Semmelweis was a doctor in Hungary and this and that. So there's basically a lot of shared stuff. Not impossible that some of them could be actually questioned at some point. But I mean, that's a sort of stock element that historians are then asked to explain somehow, make sense of it. Okay, the other problem is basically historians of science are also accused of writing this kind of utopian ideal history. Should not be written as it should have taken place, actually it was taken. So this is the prime realist intuition, I think. And already yesterday saw some talk about Frederick Liebruck was Lakatos on occasion said. Okay, so Lakatos gave ingredients for the interpretation that we can't deny. But I think this criticism misfires if we take the entire Lakatosian framework and reading and approach the history of science into account. Namely, there is no, I mean, in privileged, absolute sense, there is no one proper account. There are lots of accounts that can make sense of the past. If there isn't that thing, there is neither there is the utopian or ideal history. There are lots of bad histories, and you can criticize Lakatos or absolutely anyone. We are on the same boat, being insensitive or interpreting wrongly or making wrong inferences. But that's not the game of this kind of realism materialism debate, as this accusation seems to be telling. Indeed, Lakatos disagrees with those who recommended collecting more examples, so this kind of empirical data, before philosophizing about history. And I read this aloud. Such an inductivist theory of historiography is utopian. History without some theoretical bias is impossible. Some historians look for the discovery of hard facts, inductive generalizations, others for both theories and crucial negative experiments, and others for great simplifications or for progressive or degenerating problem shifts. All of them have some theoretical bias. History of science is a history of events which are selected and interpreted in a normative way. So this is really the core belief of Lakatos, and I think at least the recent philosophy of history really agrees. There is some bias, okay, bias, it's some normative framework. So there is, you know, just purely you can't just write history as it really has been. You're looking at imposing it somewhere. Okay, this is indeed very ideal. And there are always some methodologies and some bias. And if you compare to this, very interestingly, we could talk a lot longer about this. Let's say Latourians and this science studies literature, sociology of science basically, who questioned, you know, in some ways maybe the authority of science, but they themselves believe in the capability of sociologists or historians of science to describe history of science and peoples. So there's a very interestingly asymmetrical attitude and this non-descriptism. And I think Lakatos compares very favorably to this sociology of science in this sense. Golinsky was written maybe still the only general introduction to history of science, but this is updated, but he said, one should give up on pretense, just telling like it was. It's a pretense. And then a few more quotations from Lakatos. It's not the case that I propose rational reconstruction of the history of science as opposed to describing and explaining it. All historians of science use willy-nilly some rational reconstruction. So that was in the beginning. So that's the wrong dichotomy here. Description, normative. If both history and sociology of science are norm-impregnated, rational appraisal of scientific progress must precede
not follow full-scale empirical history. One cannot write history without some rational reconstruction. And now, indeed, the million-dollar question is how to compare and assess these different frameworks, if there are so many available, and if not, if we are not able to pick up one absolute winner. Before I get into that, I still talk about this normativity. So why to talk about rationality in the first place? Why? Because this is sort of giving up the representation of real truth in favor of rationality as an epistemic criterion. So why on earth rationality? I mean, one example is what I already, one possible interpretation is what I already mentioned, that we just think scientists are naturally rational. And that's the best form of rationality, knowledge making. And let's learn from them. Another is, this actually Brendan Marvel has hinted, not really worked out in my mind, that Lakatos had this more substantial commitment to something like Hegelian, substantial operation rationality. And I think the proof and refutation that so many have talked about would be the prime example. I think there's more work to be done, whether there's this kind of what I call hangover from his earlier career. But indeed, my suggestion is not either of those. My suggestion is to commit to maximizing rationality in order to make the past rationally comprehensible and provide rational accounts of the past, which does not, of course, entail, some historians will say, that all actors have been rational. But we can make rational sense of irrational actions. People believing in the God or in the miracles. We can't use those as explanations, but we can understand why people believed in those and why that belief in a miracle, for example, resulted in some perhaps good outcomes for them. That's my words on the paper. The correction we need to make to Lakatos is to apply rationally not to the object world, not to the past itself. The past, the people's actions, of course, is not very rational, but to the historian's account of history. So that's the philosophy of history, the graphic part. So we want to make sense, we want to have a rationally understandable account of the past. So the remaining few minutes I will now spend for telling you, spelling out the idea of what's my idea of this framework, independent and framework dependent rationality and how it might work. Okay, we will remember the Lakatosi's idea of this framework. Now the scene has changed since 60s, 70s. So we, I don't know who would ever use this anymore these days, really. We have scientific realists, it's a big legion. We have, of course, SSKs, Latourians is another big, massive group who use their own framework, their own explanatory principles, and so on. We have other, this kind of what might be called localism, as opposed to universalism. We have science as practice accounts. I call this philosophies of science in a general sense as this one, the powerful methodologies or interpretative frameworks. Of course, one might then object that they are not like fully spelled out. Well, realism is. Well, maybe localism is not. But I think it entails different kind of way to make sense of the past, as opposed to realism, who says that we can use truth as an explanatory notion, and if you have this kind of localist account, usually science is a culture, but it just expands through cultural interaction. You are not allowed to do that. And this would be a chance of creating a new comparative historiography of science. Now, how to assess them? If we give the same data now and ask historians with different frameworks to make sense. So first is that I already mentioned in the beginning is a framework-dependent rationality. So any framework comes with its own notions and principles of explanation. And this provides a chance to reinterpret internal and external. Internal is everything that can be explained by reference to its own notions within the framework.
everything that is left unexplained after the resources of this 81 framework has been used is then external. So it's from that point of view, it's an irrational, maybe irrational explanation. In this sense, rationality is a framework relative notion, and indeed irrational is something that violates those principles. Of course, this is a circulatory problem that you yesterday pointed out so well. I think we need also framework independent, because now we have this, let's say, 4 frameworks. We have 4 different accounts. They all wake up to a point, they make sense of the past, Newton's and others' actions. So what would historian interested in? What you would do? And I think I suggest the idea of framework independent rationality, and that is basically seeking overall explanatory coherence. So we wish to increase coherence. We want to have as coherent account as possible. And now, of course, we need to analyze the notion of coherence. But luckily, it has been analyzed up to a point. So we don't want to have anomalies, unexplained phenomena. We want to explain as wide explanatory, as wide scope as possible. We want to have as many inferential relations between our, statements about the past. We don't want to have knowledge-rich conditions and so on. Of course, this presupposes that we are somehow interested in the same shared history. Otherwise, we'll be totally elsewhere. It doesn't really influence material. But that must be taken as given. I mean, there would be like any kind of comparison otherwise. Okay, I'm really out of time, but maybe I just mention this briefly. I think if you want to read in the paper, it's also very briefly. But this is basically Lawrence challenge, where he says that realism entails the idea of referring theories are successful. Then he points out that some referring theories in our standards were not successful, and some non-referring theories were successful. So realism has a problem here. Instrumentalism is not. For this kind of case, for this data brought out, it's not the problem for an instrumentalist. So instrumentalists would win in this case. Here I'm imagining a case where you would have a localist versus universalist explanation. This is not the real case, but the imaginary case, where you would have 2 pockets of science you would find. I don't know if you can really find anymore. Maybe there are some cases which would have very similar features, very similar theories and so on. Which one would explain it better? And I think in this case, localism would be in trouble. Why would they be so similar? It's possible to add an ad hoc explanation, some deep cultural that we just are bound to come to some kind of theories. But universalism has another explanation saying basically that we are faced with the shared world and basically using the same observational mechanism and so forth. And that's why scientists ended up with the same kind of science. Okay, this is the conclusion. The central idea here indeed has been that the methodology, or in the form of rationality, is a substitute for truth in the historiography of science. And the 4 points: no history of science is neutral and free of some philosophical bias. There's always this normativity. Indeed, very Lakatosian idea, no historiographical research program can be definitively refuted. They are comparatively assessed. And suggested these evaluations through framework dependent and independent rationality. And the independent rationality is decisive in these comparative assessments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.